Hello and hi, and thanks for coming back to this deserted Wendy's Alley. I have no qualifications and do not exist in the state of matter that one would expect, and welcome to... Building your story setting is pretty much the entire point of world building, and for a lot of fiction, it can make or break the entire story as a whole. The world the characters live in is as vital as the characters themselves. The setting encompasses a world's environment, biomes, resources, cities, cultures, people, and so many more building blocks that all combine to help to make a world feel believable and real to your audience. But today I want to talk about the basic first steps to creating a world's location, at least according to me and how I personally like to lay out the groundwork of my story. A story is quite literally built on its environment, and so fully understanding that environment can not only give you a lot of inspiration for plot lines or events in your writing, but also promote immersion and give extra details the story wouldn't have had otherwise, that can really pull a reader into a story. Your characters do not exist in a vacuum, and creating a living, breathing world for them to interact with is, in my opinion at least, one of the best things you can do for your story. But creating an intensely detailed world from the ground up is entirely optional. I like to think that they come in levels of intensity. No research, soft research, and hard research. Now, I wouldn't say the first level is inherently bad writing, but I will say it can be seen as frustrating if there are glaring errors in your story's logic. You have to have real confidence in your subject matter or be riffing off of existing stories for this level, or have real-life experience in it. And soft research, I believe, is the most common. You want to know enough to get by, but not obsess over the minuscule details or small things when you can focus on the big picture of the story. For example, if your main character is a baker, then you'll likely want to research what a baker's daily workload looks like. But you won't go so far as to research where all the ingredients for the bread is sourced, or work to fully understand how baking chemistry works and the properties of yeast. And this is fine. It's a perfectly common and good way to write that's driven by the story you want to tell. And it's so much easier than the other level. Hard research is tough on a writer. It can take months, and it's very, very easy to get lost in rabbit holes along the way. But by the end of it, you will likely know every single thing about your world, from the species of grass that the climate promotes to how the king likes his fantasy-adjacent coffee. And if your readers catch on to that level of in-depth understanding you have of your world, it can hopefully make you look more professional, competent, and impressive as a writer. I also speak from experience when I say that fully understanding your world and setup can make the difference between a story where your characters float between settings, only interacting with what's immediately plot relevant, and an involved, grounded story where every single aspect of the world exists as part of an ecosystem that can live, breathe, and drive parts of your world's plot. And the very first step in that direction is deciding on the natural environments of your setting: mountains, geological formations, biomes, and then flora and fauna. Now, I've already gone over this section a fair amount in my map video, talking about topography, heat maps, and biomes, which are all pretty relevant here. But instead of talking about the whole world, for this video, let's narrow down the example to the area I want to set the early sections of the story in. We'll call this not Europe for now. Now, if we want to start from the absolute beginning, we'll set up a topographical map, then the heat map. Not Europe is also set in the Northern Hemisphere, so that affects when their seasons occur and the kind of biomes that'll be present. And now that we've done the initial setup, let's talk natural resources, specifically the geological ones. This is generally an overlooked field, and for a pretty understandable reason. It can get boring if it's not your thing, and it's not exactly easy to research. And depending on how in detail you want to go, we could trace European geological formations and deposits back literally millions of years. And while I really wanted to be able to go back as far as I could so I could tell you where the greatest abundances of certain minerals and alloys are and why, my initial searches for that looked like this.
Lead is formed both by neutron absorption processes and the decay of radionuclides of heavier elements. Lead has 4 stable isotopes. Their relative abundances are Lead-204, 1.48%, Lead-206, 23.6%, Lead-207, 22.6%, and Lead-208, 52.3%.
And that is so far outside of my wheelhouse, it's not even funny. So I switched gears and got a little rundown on the most important resources and their uses for our worlds. The most important rocks for civilization development are what are called native elements. Native metals and minerals are found in the earth ready-made and without needing to be mixed with other elements by humans. So, for example, iron is a native metal and is found in the earth, while steel has to be made by mixing in carbon and heat treated, and so is not a native metal. So let's start with what I, and nobody else, call the aesthetic elements. These are gold, platinum, silver, precious stones, and diamonds. These elements are largely used for non-essential, mostly decorative purposes. Gold, silver, and platinum are all rare, soft, and shiny metals, making them only really useful for carving into sculptures and trinkets for aesthetic or religious purposes. And all three are native metals. Precious stones are pretty, but in terms of practicality, they're fairly useless, with the small exception of clear quartz and other crystals being used in eyeglasses from the 13th century to the 1720s. But there's a long history of stones and crystals being used for decorative, medicinal, and religious purposes. And even today, precious stones are collected by many due to these long-standing beliefs. And I personally know a lot of people who swear by precious stones and crystals' ability to heal ailments. So, incorporating concepts like that into your story could be very interesting. Similar to, but not exactly like precious stones, are diamonds, being the rare exception of most gemstones by actually being incredibly useful and therefore not exactly an aesthetic element. Diamonds are, of course, the hardest substance known to man, and as such are used for cutting hard materials, making it officially the most useful gemstone. Next, we have the crafting materials: copper, bronze, brass, iron, aluminum, tin, lead, and zinc. These elements, while not exactly practical or in enough abundance to build a house out of, make for excellent crafting materials for things like swords, ammunition, armor, smithing tools, and food cans. Copper is the oldest metal ever to be used by humans. It's a native metal that was used as far back as 10 to 8,000 BCE. Soft, malleable, and with a high conductivity, copper has tons of modern uses, even after it was replaced in history by iron. It's also the one that goes green from oxidization, which I always mix up with bronze. Bronze and brass are man-made metals made with copper mixed with tin and zinc respectively. Bronze was pretty important during, the Bronze Age, when it was used for pretty much everything from weaponry and armor to chariot parts, but nowadays it's only really used for making sculptures and musical instruments. Brass is pretty old too, but was mostly used for decoration or tools that benefit from brass being a corrosive-resistant material, like plumbing, hinges, and gears. Tin, zinc, and aluminium are fairly soft metals that all have different uses. Aluminium is one of the most abundant metals in the Earth's crust and is more malleable than steel, so it's used today for things that steel is too stiff and heavy for. Tin was used to make bronze, but its discovery as a metal is lost to history. Tin and aluminium are used for fairly similar things, like cans for food preservation. Zinc is pretty much only used to galvanize other metals today to prevent rusting, like to help make stainless steel. Lead is soft and heavy and good for weights, but don't use it to pipe your drinking water or boil your soups in. Throughout modern history, lead has been used for pigments, bullets, weights, solders, and radiation protection. But lead's ability to make people very sick and also crazy puts it solidly in the yikes category for me. But it could be interesting for plot. And we can't forget iron, the most useful metal since the Iron Age. While iron is a native metal, it does need to be smelted down in order to be used, which is why copper came first on the civilization timeline. Nowadays, iron can be turned into steel, stainless steel, and cast iron, and is used for a huge number of things. And then we have the construction materials: marble, alabaster, and granite. These are the only three I'll be covering in this section because they also can be traded as valuables. Marble, of course, is soft, nice to carve, and has pretty textures. The better the quality, the higher the price, of course. Alabaster is the shiny crystalline cousin to marble. It's also primarily used for sculptures. Last is granite. It's a much harder rock that forms when magma solidifies. It's used for construction, building, and monuments, and despite being pretty dangerous to mine even today, there's evidence that it's been in use since ancient Egypt. And that's about it, other than the more obscure minerals and ones that only have modern construction uses like sand and gravel. I tried to stick with mostly native elements, since they're the most prominent ones in history. And while it can seem a little over the top to include something like minerals in a video about story settings, it can be pretty important to your world, particularly for subjects like political intrigue and trade and civilization management. A collection of people with plenty of gold in the local rivers could build their entire culture around it, or it could cause a gold rush and the rise of an empire, or unwanted immigration, or a bigger country stealing their land. Marble could be one of a kingdom's largest exports, or maybe a small country has a lack of a really necessary resource like iron, and that leaves them entirely dependent on another country for an incredibly vital metal. But moving on, let's talk about flora. Plant life's one of the most important parts of a setting, since it dictates pretty much everything to do with your world's background. And step 1 is finding your biomes. I like to place a lot of my research on the real world, so by looking at how real-world biome maps and European environments are set up today, I can take inspiration from these and add them to my map. I already did this section in my last video, but there's no harm in going back and refining older work. The major biomes in not Europe are montane forests, alpine tundras, broadleaf forests, coniferous forests, taigras, deserts, xeric shrublands, and the Mediterranean biome. Now, I can't really break down every biome here in full, since I already did that in my maps video, but let's talk about the important things to look into for your specific world building, and I'll try to break it down as best I can. And as an example, we'll be using the temperate forest, or temperate deciduous biome, since it's a pretty standard setting for a lot of writing, and happens to cover massive amounts of both Europe and not Europe. Temperature decides a lot of your setting, and temperate forests have a broad climate of 3 to 23 degrees Celsius, 37 to 73 degrees Fahrenheit on a yearly average, with extremes at 30 to negative 30 degrees Celsius, negative 22 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on how severe the winters and summers are. Precipitation. The temperate biome is the second rainiest, only to the rainforest, with an average yearly rainfall of 750 to 1,500 millimeters, meaning it's gonna be pretty wet and pretty miserable for most of the year. Plant life. Temperate broadleaf forests have temperate broadleaf trees, and a quick Google search will give you plenty of lists on the most common tree species in your chosen biome. For example, beech, oak, ash, and birch trees are the most common in not Europe, but I'd recommend finding just full reference images from the areas or biomes you want to base your fictional setting on, since it'll give you a much better idea of the environment than just looking at individual trees. And when you do look at trees on their own, it'll only be to find what resources they provide for your characters to collect. Foliage also falls under this category. Ground cover and shrubbery are important parts of an ecosystem, as humble as they are, and add extra detail and resources to your setting. And one of the most important points of a biome is to provide your characters with resources. And in the world of flora, these resources are forageables and natural tools. Now, I'm not gonna claim I know everything about all the things nature can provide, but I will try to cover what I know currently, and I hope this can be used as a good jumping off point if you want to look more into it yourself. Right. Of course, wood and branches can be used for firewood and building materials. Leaves and grass can make a simple waterproof roof in a pinch. Digging a hollow into the ground, even a shallow one, can help conserve a shelter's heat. Polypore mushrooms can be used for transporting embers over long distances because they burn slow and flameless. Birch is useful for everything from making thin clothings to bags and woven shoes, and its inner bark is completely edible. Birch dry and green bark can be burnt down into an adhesive called birch pitch, and there are so many plants that are either believed to have or actually do have medicinal properties. Pine needles can be brewed into a tea that's higher in vitamin C than lemons. Bishop's lace used to be a natural and very, very dangerous way to induce abortions and as a dye. Wood sorrel, which is found almost everywhere, prevents scurvy and alleviates thirst. Catkin down and moss can be used as insulation in homes. Slow fruit makes a blue dye, and blackwood sap is a paint. And that's not even counting what you can eat. Every single part of the pine tree is edible. Cattail roots, green catkins, new shoots, and pollen are all edible. Birch sap makes a good syrup and a beer. So many mushrooms are edible, and so many can kill you. Primrose leaves make good salad greens. Crab apples make excellent fermented winter food. Blackberries, rose hips, bilberries, and rowan berries are all excellent sources of food, but rowan berries are poisonous if raw. Also, I hope this goes without saying, please don't try eating any of these at home without looking into it a lot more. Please don't die. I could honestly go on for years in this category, and it really deserves its own video someday, but for now, that's what I do know. Animals are fun to write about, but also very subjective to their environment, meaning I can't give you a generalized list of animals for your specific setting. But I will say that your environment doesn't only revolve around mammalian prey, predators, and birds. You also have bugs, reptiles, and amphibians to look into as well. And of course, the colder the environment, the less bugs and amphibians you're going to have. And some of the species you'll find in one part of the world won't be in the same biome in a different part of the world. When I have to research big sections like this, I like to start by finding as many names as possible. And then from there, I sorted them along their respective food chain or type. This way, I have an easy reference to go back to should I need it for the story. There's also the resources animals can give your characters. For example, and content warning here for a somewhat violent description, every part of the deer is usable, from the meat, liver, kidneys, heart, and tongue, all being edible, to the intestines able to be repurposed as sausage casings and cords. Tails can make fishing lures, doe urine makes a deer lure and cover scent for further hunting, and can also be used to remove hair from the leather for tanning preparations along with the brain. The hide is of course used as cloth. The rawhide can be used for rope, laces, straps, drumheads, or dog chews. The blood makes a natural fertilizer. The bones can be boiled into a soup. The fat can be boiled into tallow, which can be used to make primitive candles or torches, and can also be used to waterproof, lubricate, and grease tools and cloth. Tallow can also be stored for up to a year as a winter survival food. Teeth can be sewn into clothing as buttons. Sinew can make cords, sutures, and bowstrings since it's more delicate than rawhide. The bones, once boiled, can be turned into a compost or can be carved into needles, knives, tools, fishhooks, jewelry, and arrowheads. And when the bones are dry, they can burn longer and hotter than firewood since the fat within the bone can fuel the fire. Antlers, on top of having many religious significances throughout cultures, can also make knife handles, whistles, and fire strikers. And that was just the research I did on specifically the fallow deer. Every animal can be used to the fullest by humans who know how to use them, or can be wasted by someone who's inexperienced. The wildlife can thrive in your world or be systematically destroyed by a civilization that abuses them. They can be tamed and make excellent fictional companions for your characters, or be wild, potentially deadly obstacles in their path. Before we call it a day, I'd like to talk about the biggest reason I like to pay particular attention to settings in writing. The reason I do, and maybe go a little overboard on it, is because it's something that's pretty often overlooked in writing, with a lot of stories depending on template backgrounds for settings. Not so much in written fiction, but definitely so in movies or comics. And for me at least, half the joy of world building is finding the unique quirks and aesthetics of each environment and figuring out how cultures and kingdoms could grow and develop from it. It can feel like a chore to do so much intense research, especially if you go into it in even more detail than this video. But putting the work in here can set you up with the knowledge you'll need to know every inch of your setting and move forwards into the other parts of your world building with a clear understanding of the environment you're building from. You could even learn things you didn't know you didn't know. It's always amazing for me when I find some cool new thing that I can include in my world to make it that much more alive to me. But of course, this way of writing your story is entirely subjective and a lot of work. And if you don't think it's the right method for your workflow, and if your story doesn't need to worry about the abundance of specific minerals, that's absolutely fine. But if it does, then I hope you found this video useful. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Okay, so when I started writing the script for this video, it was actually supposed to be about megafauna. I really wanted to talk about megafauna during the 50,000s BCE. I had a list. I did a bunch of research on the Glacier Maximum and the late Paleolithic and Pleistocene eras, and cross-referenced a bunch of information to kind of figure out what the world would be like, and then I tried to tie it all into the advice I had for this video, and it was just so much content, and it just really confused the video structure and the writing advice, so I split them into two. This video was all about the basics of how to build the very core parts of your world, and next month there'll be a video on megafauna. It'll be a lot more fun, I promise. So stay tuned for that. I know I'm excited for it.